Hi, everyone, and we're back to the Neil Haley Show in the Total Celebrity segment. And I'm excited to welcome, I guess you probably have worn every hat, a director, a producer, everything. Joel Soisson, how are you, man? And you know what? It's interesting. Your career has spanned a long time, hasn't it? How long have you been in this industry?
Yeah, it's scary when I look back at it because I realize that that's a lot of water over the dam. But I started, like most people do, as a PA gopher type guy in the early '80s. When was that? Somewhere in the last century.
Really? Okay, so let's start out. Did you always want to be involved in film? Is that something?
Not like a lot of people. It seems like there's a whole generation that I grew up with that wanted to be like astronauts and doctors and lawyers and all the Indian chief kind of things. And then they saw Star Wars and they knew exactly what they wanted to be for the rest of their life. That didn't happen to me. I didn't have that epiphany. I just kind of liked art in the beginning. I went to art school, wanted to be a painter, got into the visual side, drifted into animation, from animation into motion pictures. And from there, it was all about just finding a job on a set and working my way up. And at a certain point, I think I knew this wasn't a lark and it was something I'd like to do for a while. I didn't know that while would be the next 40 years.
40 years, and you don't look it. Is that because you love what you do?
Thank you. Thank you. It's formaldehyde. I highly recommend it.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about it. You started out like the PA route, all that different things. So once you found out film is what you wanted to do, how did you say, I'm going to go out and do this? It seems like you just said, I'm going to start from the ground up.
Yeah. I recommend to anybody who's interested is just work every job you can get. I wanted to be a cinematographer. That was my goal because it goes back to the visual side of the medium. And I'm really at the end of, or nearing the end of my career, possibly, still a frustrated cinematographer. I never got that goal because I wound up finding something else I could do and somebody wanted to hire me for. And that started off as a writer. I was listening to a producer named Sandy Howard that I worked for back in the early '80s, saying he wanted to do a kind of a dog movie, family film. Dog gets lost in the New York airport and he has to go all the way across the country to find his mistress, Lillian Gish. And I just said, well, hey, what if here's an idea. And I gave him 2 pages and he said, yeah, okay, you write it. And from then on, I was a writer. And then, producer and a few other things, and ended up doing some directing. And yeah, a couple movies came and went during that time.
Definitely did. So would you feel when you were part of that you were meant for more?
I'll tell you one thing that I look back at, if I'm you and here's this guy that I'm going to interview and I look at his resume and wow, this guy does horror movies. That's what he's all about. And it really wasn't at all what I was about. I like horror films. I don't sort of live and breathe them, but I did a couple early on in my career that were successful, and success obviously is what breeds success. And pretty soon you find yourself, I don't want to say typecast, but that's your kind of go-to genre. And I could get movies made so easily as a horror filmmaker. And then when I wanted to do, nobody wanted my version of My Best Friend's Wedding, I just said, okay, that's a harder road for me. So I will stick with the slash and burn,
See, and the thing, horror movies in the 80s, but I'm going to go, I have to go. There's 2 things we'll talk about first. Then we're going to talk about Harvey Weinstein. I can't believe we can talk about this. Is just like the greatest questions. See, but that's your PR. Hey, I can't help it, man. I'm more interested in I'm honestly really more interested in and Freddie and Nightmare. My co-host is joining us.
Happy to talk about anything. No worries.
We'll just keep talking. So let's talk first about Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I watched that movie 150 times. I started to get into horror. I had it on a VHS tape that somebody bootlegged. Sorry, took
Mhm.
took different things, so
I'm keeping track.
confessions. Hey, I'm 6'10", so get me in a horror flick. Are you gonna can you ever, do you think you could use some of my size?
You bet. You bet. Absolutely.
Okay, all right, because I don't want lines, I just want to kill people.
Okay.
Sorry.
You are totally right for us. Hey,
Dave's here. Dave, we're just keep talking, and you could go question.
hey, Dave.
We're talking to Dave. Once Dave's on, his people, we don't see the camera yet because we're just going back and forth. Once I see him talk, he's good.
Okay.
All right, so let's just jump to Nightmare on Elm Street. Oh my gosh! I mean, how did you get involved in this film? And did you think it would be such a cult classic that people are still talking about today? To the level, yeah.
Yes and no, actually. And I have to say, I geeked out on that first one just like you did. I saw that movie and I thought, okay, that is nearly the perfect horror film. And when Bob Shea at New Line called myself and my then producing partner over to make the sequel, it was like, yeah, how could we say no to this? It's just like a dream come true to be involved in that franchise. And it was one of the special horror films that I've been involved in. Some of them, not so excitedly, but definitely Nightmare.
How much? It didn't cost much to make. Like it was a cult classic, but didn't expect to be, right?
Yeah. Well, Bob Shea made that film on a wing and a prayer with no money. It was like, and he had no profit participation. He sold all his rights away and basically just said, look, I love this film so much. I just want to get it made. And it wasn't until number 2 that we produced that he had a chance to actually make some money and save his then very fledgling studio. And so as important as Nightmare 1 was creatively to Bob, Nightmare 2 was the survival of his whole dream as a film mogul. And it paid off in multiples. It was a huge success.
And that's awesome. Dave, were you a fan of Nightmare on Elm Street in the 80s?
No, but I was a fan of Bill and Ted.
Okay, so we'll go to the Bill and Ted question for you. We'll say Bill and Ted for you.
Oh man, I can please everybody on this interview. This is great.
It was a bit, and that's what's funny. It's a bit, here's my joke, I guess. It was a bit gory, and that's probably why. I mean, think about this, beautiful girls, right? There is everything that you want in a teenage slasher flick. However, it could be a nightmare for people after watching this film.
Yeah.
And I remember that between that and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they're probably the 2 most dangerous films for nightmares for people after watching them, right or wrong?
Well, it was a brilliant conceit that Wes had for that film. And why I think it's so brilliant is you can run away from the Texas Chainsaw guy, you can run away from Jason or Michael Myers or any of those guys, but you have to sleep. And how many of us, whether it was finals in school or whatever, we just had to stay awake and couldn't. And that slow fighting sleep and staying awake and knowing you're going to lose that battle. And in this particular movie, you lose that battle, you lose your life. And it was so relatable, much more relatable than being in a camp, in a cabin on a lake in a campground or something. It's like, okay.
Yeah, come on, that's not going to happen. But something coming in your nightmares that really happened when we all have nightmares. That's so true. And then to wake up and you couldn't run away. And
then to know that your parents were guilty of the reason why you're being stalked in your sleep. So that whole chain of responsibility and guilt that comes through this. I mean, Wes is a master when it comes to the whole psychology of people and not just the latex monster running around, chopping people up. That's what I really got into.
What was your job as a producer when you have someone working like Wes? And then I'm going to allow Bill and Ted questions because Dave's already frightened by the nightmare question.
Dave's he's wandered off already. Come back, Dave. We'll get to
Bill. No, he doesn't have his camera on. That's okay. It's fine.
I know. I'm kidding. Anyway, I've worked with Wes time again over the years as a producer, as a writer, on Dracula 2000 that he presented. And I've come in and rewritten like Scream 4, which, you know, he was not too happy about. And I shot trailers for, what was it, Cursed, I think, that he wasn't happy about. I mean, there were things that we clashed on creatively, largely because many of those times I was the guy who was answering to the studio, and he was the other guy saying, this is how I want to do it as an auteur. So I love the man. I have huge respect for him, but it wasn't always like an easy relationship between the two of us. And in the case of Nightmare 2, it was a very pleasant relationship because he wasn't the director. It was a guy named Jack Shoulder, and he had basically sort of stepped back from it and said, you know what, I've created the world. Now somebody else gets to inhabit it. And so it was fun to do that. There's two modes in my career, one where we create the world and the other one where we come into someone else's world and make a sequel out of it. And then you're bound by kind of a Bible of rules, which is kind of fascinating.
Okay, now to Bill and Ted. Dave, go ahead.
Well, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, were you doing writing, acting, producing, directing first? What and how did Bill and Ted come across your desk, so to speak?
There was a very famous Italian producer named Dino De Laurentiis. I don't know if that name rings a bell to anybody, but he came to the US during the 80s and started a studio, De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, to stand up to the studios and compete with them. And he brought us over, having seen Nightmare 2, to make his own little sort of horror film in that world called Trick or Treat, or Trick and Treat, he called it, because he had no idea what Trick or Treat even was. He just liked the name. So he made this horror film, which became a little bit of a cult classic of its own. And the next thing, because of the success of that, he said, hey, I'll sign you up to like a 5-picture deal. So we had a development guy named Mike Petzold who was out there looking for the best script he could find. And he brought back in like a week this script called Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and said, you have to make this. And I said, I read it and I thought it was just amazingly good, but convincing this Italian producer who barely understood English to make this movie about a bunch of kids in San Dimas, California, it was, you know, the whole culture of teenage, you know, Bill and Ted speak was utterly beyond his grasp. But what wasn't was the fact that he had made one of the definitive Napoleon epics. And so when he saw that Napoleon showed up in our movie, that was the breakthrough. It was like, oh, Napoleon's in it. Okay. And what about and what?
And Genghis Khan.
And Genghis Khan, yeah, I don't think he was as wired into Genghis, but Napoleon, man, that was it. And then when he was mistranslated a scene early in the movie that was, I think it was exterior, the world of San Dimas. And I think he interpreted it as the War of San Dimas. So the War of San Dimas, Napoleon, that was really enough to get him into the movie. And we were off and running.
Well, whatever it takes.
Exactly. That's if I can boil my career down to 3 words, it would be that.
Now, Keanu Reeves, was that his very first role or was he doing stuff before?
No, it wasn't. He had done a very serious and a super movie called The River's Edge, I think before Bill and Ted's, if I'm not mistaken. But when he walked in as Ted, I mean, everybody knew that was there was no more casting after that for that role. He just defined it and owned it, and kind of has owned it ever since. I think there's 2 Keanu Reeves now. There's that guy, and then there's the Matrix guy, and he sort of bounces in between. A brilliant guy, and I think he's deservedly an icon. But yeah, I mean, if there was any kind of aha moment in the movie, in the process of making it, it was Keanu.
And the actor that was with him, I can't remember his name, but
Alex Winter.
Yeah, a little less known. What has he done since or before?
Alex, it's interesting that you couldn't really come up with two more different approaches to the filmmaking as a craft. Alex, I thought, was equally good, but he was riding off this kind of thing for us of the Spicoli vibe, you know, that from Fast Times.
Yes.
We kind of saw and understood what he was and how he sort of fit into the thing. And I think he did brilliantly. But Alex is a thinker. I mean, he wanted to do conceptual movies, avant-garde stuff. He went off and did super daring art films as a director and a writer and an actor, and has done some powerful documentaries recently, and some acting. Obviously, he's showed up in the last most recent Bill and Ted, but that's his trajectory. He's a complete filmmaker.
So he's successful in his own right as well.
Yes, he is.
And he's still getting paid probably for Bill and Ted. Yes.
A couple nickels and dimes fall into his lap from Bill and Ted.
And then they did another one, right? They did the other newest one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So jumping here to Harvey Weinstein before his latest project, I have to go to the first thing about his relationship with Harvey. And now, just I guess I don't know where to go with those questions. Just your experience working with him, because.
Well, I'll frame it a little bit differently, because I worked from the mid 90s on to up till about 6 or 7 years ago. I worked almost exclusively with the Weinsteins in their various incarnations, Miramax and Dimension and the Weinstein Company. But it was almost exclusively with Bob Weinstein, not Harvey, because I did my first film that got me in the door with those guys was a film called Mother's Boys, which Harvey was producing. And he's the first one to hire me. And short story version, we didn't click. He fired my sorry ass.
So it's so funny. You talk about Wes and you not getting on. So you're pretty vicious, tough director. In a way, would you say? If
anything, I'm just too nice and not savage enough for a lot of these people. I think not so much with Wes, but with other studio execs who want probably more blood in the water than I'm willing to cause. But Bob was a tyrant, but somebody that I actually connected with and understood that he was ultimately acting out of love of the film that he was making and a commitment to getting a job done. Harvey, I think, was a different animal entirely that I don't pretend to be able to psychoanalyze, except that I was probably one of the charter members of the Harvey Haters Club, even before the whole Me Too thing came along. And such that whenever I was at the Weinstein Company, literally I would sink into a doorway and get out of the way when Harvey was going by, because I didn't want him to stop and look at me and go, "What is that son of a bitch doing in my office? I already fired him."
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And so, I spent a lot of time avoiding Harvey until there was a certain point when enough distance had been between our encounters that I don't think he would have recognized me and picked me out of a police lineup, in which case I could attend some of the Dimension parties and gatherings and show up on set when he was there. So yeah, I just found that he was a man lacking in any kind of human qualities that I could relate to. And it wasn't until obviously much later that we all saw that there were things that none of us knew that he was doing that surpassed even what I would have accused him of being at the time.
Did your association with him, even though it was very minimal, have any impact on, when the proverbial crap hit the fan, so to speak?
No, my only question really was, and is to this day, how to deal with. I'm actually friends with Bob Weinstein and would work with him in a heartbeat.
Okay.
And this whole concept that we as a culture, I'm sorry to drift into this, but
That's okay.
it's part of the whole Harvey thing, is that there's a tendency for the public to look at Harvey and Bob in the same sphere, that they're two sides of the same coin, and they're not. And I think there's been a great unfairness caused by this tendency to want to drag everybody down by association, that you're your brother's keeper, and that you are responsible for anything that the people in your circle do. And I truly don't believe that Bob was culpable in any way in facilitating Harvey's predations, except to the extent that he might have not stopped him soon enough. But they were barely speaking, if at all, for the last 5 years that I was working there. I mean, there was an enmity between those two that I don't pretend to understand fully, but they were not co-conspirators in Harvey's affairs. And so that, to me, the downfall of both brothers, I think, was an over extension of the revulsion that people had toward Harvey.
All right, so tell us about the new film now, because we're coming close to running out of time. My Best Worst Adventure. It's a family film. I was thinking we're going to go horror and slashing. Now you're totally just taking me. The next horror film, I'm going to be one of your killers, right? That's for sure. We're going to make that happen, right?
Yeah, you know what? Forgive me, but it may be a sequel, because I do a lot of horror sequels, and you may wind up like not being the guy that defines that character. You may be the guy, oh, so now he's being played by Neil, when before he was being played by somebody we recognized from Halloween 1. Anyway, this movie is not a horror film, yet in a sort of way it is, because I couldn't escape that that background, I guess, because it's about a girl from LA who comes from a shattered family that causes her to actually become mute, and she winds up essentially being shipped off to this tiny, bizarre town in northern Thailand, as if she had been dropped on an alien planet and surrounded by predatory monsters. And so that's how she looked at it. And that's how that was my window into the movie. And so I sort of ran with that idea.
And how you felt so far about everything, how it turned out and everything?
It's probably, with respect to Bill and Ted and Nightmare being two of my favorite movies I've worked on, this is the film I am most proud of having been involved with, because it has everything for me. It has character and heart and suspense and comedy and drama and a heavy dose of weirdness, and all centered around this sport of buffalo racing, which is really just crazy in itself. It's these kids that actually ride stampeding buffaloes for sport and risk every time they climb on top of these things of getting trampled to death. And that has become sort of a national sport in Thailand. And wow. It's truly bizarre. It's like watching Seabiscuit with no guardrails.
Wow.
Okay. Speaking of sequels,
but please do.
Are you the king of sequels? Is that what I read, or is that somebody else?
Somebody in some website wrote that I was the direct-to-video sequel king, and
okay.
I wasn't sure whether it was great to be a king of a small empire, or whether it was better to drop
Well,
that handle
Star
entirely.
Wars franchise, it's a good thing.
Exactly.
Any talk about another Bill and Ted, or are they just too old for it to work?
That, to me, that's kind of a certain point one wants to move on.
And it wouldn't work. New actors, of course, because it's just not the same thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something, and this is just me, of course, being proprietary, but there's something really charming about the first couple, and you just want to leave it. Dumb and Dumberer didn't work, and you just don't go there too many times to the well. For me, is I don't know. There are other things that we can be doing, but there are some sequels have more potential than others. I would, for instance, I'd make another in the Prophecy series in a heartbeat, because there's so much richness there to explore for anybody who has seen it and knows what I'm talking about. But now I'm actually into a new thing, which is the next couple films I have coming up are sort of reimaginings of old classic films. Like I'm shooting one in a couple weeks with Danny Trejo in the lead as a sort of a reimagining of the Magnificent Seven in a sort of a modern context. And another one later on in South Africa, if this whole variant thing calms down, which is a reimagining of Treasure of the Sierra Madre, the old bogey film. So for me, that's a different kind of like sequel. It's not like a numerical sequel, but it's taking an idea that was really pretty cool and putting your own spin onto it.
All right, so we're going to jump back to Dave. It has his final question. That's why he's called the caregiver. You're going to find out, Joel, why he's the caregiver. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, my wife had a stroke 25 years ago. She was only 52. And
man,
lost her speech, became paralyzed. But after a couple of years of grieving, she decided to reinvent herself. And now she's like amazing. She does almost everything she did before with one arm and one leg tied behind her back and basically duct tape over her mouth. And I became Dave, the caregiver's caregiver, helping other caregivers survive and thrive this thing called caregiving, because 30% of them actually die before their loved ones do. You know, I've been on 50 morning shows. They're making a movie about our life together. And so my question to you is, I believe that everyone is eventually going to either become a caregiver or need a caregiver. Now's the time to prepare for it. Is caregiving in your life? Do you know anyone who has needed care by you or close family members?
You know what? I am so impressed with that, because I don't think there's a higher purpose in life than doing what you're doing, which is helping another kindred soul, especially one that's obviously very dear to you, have a richly deserved life. And the closest thing for me right now, and it's been a real eye-opener for a lot of reasons, largely because of what you say, that eventually, you know, we will find ourselves being the cared for at some point in our lives. But my wife's 94-year-old mother, you know, is now learning about incapacities. And when you're fiercely independent, as I bet your wife was, to learn to accept care is as hard as it is to give care at a lot of the time. And watching that, how somebody navigates that, because I'm getting to a point where I am describing myself as a on the threshold senior citizen, I guess we'd call it.
And they've done that.
Yeah, and you see that this is a trajectory that you're going to have to navigate at some point yourself. And what a learning experience to see how somebody does it well.
Exactly.
How and I can only imagine just the fact that you're still there and smiling, that your wife has figured it out and taught you some really valuable lessons.
We're both smiling. Go to caregiverdave.com and you'll find out why.
All right.
Perfect.
So finished up, Joel. So when are you going to have me in? I'm 6'10", 285 pounds. Got to get me in a horror film at one point in time.
Do you have time for a quick audition?
What do you want me to do?
I want you to just look in the camera and choke it out with your scary face.
Choke the camp like that.
Yeah, like if the camera was right here, you're gonna reach in and you're just gonna choke that camera out and you're gonna scare the hell out of us.
Okay. All right.
Scare me, Neil. Scare me.
All I can say is that's a whole lot better than what I expected. Wow.
Okay.
Wow. I got a little bit of it. What do you think, Dave? I got a little chill out of that.
Well, it would have been better if he was a little further back because I couldn't see from half the eyeballs up.
But
Oh,
he saw the
no.
eyes and everything. That's from pro wrestling. I put my whole wrestling. I was a bad guy in wrestling, so I know how to do
Yeah,
it.
no, he did it. And I think the lean in was because I leaned back for that. That was like, whoa.
Yeah.
This guy's serious.
I have to watch that on film. Go figure. I've challenged people as boxers, everything. We'll stay in touch. Best place we can connect with you in the film. Where's the best place?
Well, I am at Joel Soisson. Our movie, which I'd love you to visit. We have all connections and great reviews and links and other good stuff. Is at My Best ADV Adventure. And we're on Facebook at My Best Worst Adventure. So if you just hit that little Google thing, we old people don't really quite know how it works yet, but if you type in the name on your QWERTY device or whatever, or speak it, you'll see it come up and there'll be all sorts of cool options. We're out today.
Awesome.
So this is especially cool to be able to talk to you on our debut day, and go see it, because if you like any of the stuff I've ever done, as hopefully somebody does, I think you'll really like this.
All right. Awesome. Well, it was an honor, Joel, to have you on the show. Thanks again. Appreciate it. That, guys, was the Caregiver Dave Celebrity segment. Take care.
Thank